Good afternoon and welcome to the Social Venture Partners Dallas Workshop, Engaging the Media During COVID-19. My name is Prisma Garcia and I'm the Director of Capacity Building at SVP Dallas. SVP is a network of engaged philanthropists in the DFW area that give back with their skill set. This event would not be possible with the gracious support of our sponsors, Something Good Consulting Group and Right Condenser. Thank you so much for your support and your work in corporate social responsibility in North Texas. As the COVID-19 pandemic accelerates, we're hearing a lot of noise in the media, and we're also having to move to different means such as online communications. Today we have with us Creighton Webb, owner and CEO of SunWest Communications. We have Diane Solis, staff writer at the Dallas Morning News. Sean Williams, Vice President at Allen Media. Mike Wilson, the editor at the Dallas Morning News. And we have our very own Alexandra Yap, an SVP Dana Jewett resident alumna, and she's also in brand PR and brand management at the Richards Group. Today, we will explore methods of how you can increase your impact within your organization by amplifying your message through the media. So we're going to start off with some brief introductions, and we're going to kick it off with Creighton.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to see all of you. Thanks for taking your noon hour to join us. My name is Creighton Webb. I'm the owner and CEO of SunWest Communications. We're a public relations and crisis communications firm founded in Dallas in 1982. I'm a recovering journalist. I was a television news reporter. Last stop was at Channel 11 here in Dallas, Fort Worth. Went on to do nonprofit work as director of communications for the United Way, was chief of staff for Dallas Mayor Laura Miller, and then spent 12 years at Mary Kay Cosmetics in government relations as a lobbyist, and then as vice president of corporate communications and corporate social responsibility. And now am in the agency world. So it's nice to be with you all today. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Creighton. We will turn it over to Diane Solis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Solis, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. Thank you for the invite and joining us. I have been a journalist for about 30 years now. I'm a former foreign correspondent based in Mexico, and that set me up well to cover immigration for the Dallas Morning News. Right now, I also cover social justice issues from time to time. Mostly, though, I like to think that what I'm trying to do is tell memorable stories.
Thank you, Diane. We'll pass it off to Sean Williams.
Hello, and thank you to SVP for giving me a reason to put on real clothes. I really appreciate that. My name is Sean Williams. I started out as the founder of DallasSouthBlog.com. Which eventually became a nonprofit called Dallas South News. And both of those had a focus on telling stories in Southern Dallas, stories that hadn't been told, I felt correctly, and focused on people of color and African Americans. And after that, I spent a year as Deputy Chief of Staff for former Dallas Mayor Mike Rawlings, as well as Deputy Chief of Staff for a year for former Dallas Police Chief David Brown. And in between that, I spent about 6 months as interim public information officer for the city of Dallas. And for the last 4 years, I have been a vice president at Allen Media, a local public relations firm on the public affairs team, where I founded and serve as leader of our social justice practice.
Thank you, Sean. Mike Wilson, the editor of the Dallas Morning News.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Thank you, SVP, for including me on the panel. I'm Mike Wilson. I'm the editor of the Dallas Morning News and dallasnews.com. Proud to be on this panel with everybody, and always proud to share a panel with my colleague, Diane Solis. I'm coming to you from the Uptown Bureau of the Dallas Morning News and from the kitchen table where the Morning News has been produced since about March 11th. I'm excited to talk about the challenging and interesting times that we're in and see how I can help with your questions.
Thank you, Mike. And last but not least, we have Alex Yap.
Thank you, Prisma, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Alex Yap. I'm in my 8th year at Richards Partners, the public relations and cause branding arm of the Richards Group. For the past 8 years, I've worked on a variety of brands, both here in North Texas and around the country, including the Salvation Army, Scottish Rite for Children, Reunion Tower, and several other nonprofits and for-profit organizations. And as Prisma mentioned, I'm a recent graduate of the Dana Jewett Residency Program through Social Venture Partners, and really excited to be here today.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. Today we're hoping to hear a lot more. As you can tell already, there's so many different perspectives and different experiences our panelists have had within media. And so it seems like we have every single angle, within their experience. And so if you've joined us for other workshop events, you know that we typically do a deep dive with each of the panelists to get a perspective from them based on the topic. And today we're looking at how do we engage the media within this time of COVID and also all of the racial injustices happening in our society. And so we're going to do a panelist perspectives and move through the different panelists, and then we'll have time for questions. And so if you look, the Q&A is open, and so you could start submitting your questions as the panelists are speaking, but we will have time for those at the end. So we're going to start off with Alex today with this deep dive.
Thank you, Prisma. Yeah, it's been really interesting to see the news cycle continue to evolve over the past several months. And something that we've talked a little bit about, both as a panel and internally, is that really the tenets of public relations have never been more true than they are today. Even before the pandemic, we were starting to see that everything was political. News was driving politics, policymakers drive the news cycle. But right when COVID-19 hit, for a few weeks at the beginning, everything was all COVID all the time. And now as the conversation around COVID-19 has become more politicized and it's compounded even further by conversations about racial equity, it's getting harder and harder to break through the clutter. But some things that we've learned, there's really no magic bullet. Breaking through will look different for every brand, every organization. It's really important to take part in some of these conversations, because if you don't speak, you don't have a voice, and that can often speak volumes. Your silence does go noticed, but at the same time, if you are going to insert yourself into the conversation, it's important, really important, to speak with authenticity so that whatever you're portraying doesn't come across as hollow. And the key to doing that is really showing the solution that you're providing or the problem that you're trying to solve and how you're evolving to do that. We've seen a lot of brands, just by nature of either increased operations or loss in funding, have to evolve really quickly and rapidly in a short amount of time as need has continued to grow in a really vast variety of ways. And then really, it's still all about relationships. Before the pandemic, we saw that newsrooms were shrinking, beats were already changing. And now, just like everyone else in who's facing challenges, we're seeing that a lot of people are either getting laid off, or they're facing pay cuts, or they're being furloughed, or if they're reporting, they're neck deep in covering crises, either going right into the heart of conflict, whether there's protests or going into hotspots. And so it's really important to remember that reporters are people too, and just the same way that we check in on the health and mental health of our friends and family, looking out for our colleagues and asking them how they're doing, and knowing that they're really busy. So what can we do to be a good resource for them? How can we support them in the work that they're doing as well?
Thank you, Alex. And I think that that's, also why we're here, right? We're looking for stories from people, and that's really what our organization, social impact organizations, want to share. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Sean Williams.
Thank you. I wanted to first just start by saying that as we speak here today, one of our great icons, John Lewis, is being funeralized, and I want to encourage all of the nonprofit leaders and social entrepreneurs to stir up some good trouble like John Lewis encouraged us to do. When I started Dallas South News back in 2009 as a nonprofit, I sat down very early with Robert Wright, founder of SVP. And one of the things he talked to me about was being mission focused. And as media platforms change, as we see new digital platforms that come online for us to use, it's so important to remain mission focused, even if we decide to go about doing our business in different ways. And I joined Twitter in 2008, and ever since then, it's really been my main source of ways to get messages out about me, about my organization. But since I started back in 2008, there's so much more misinformation, so much more noise, so much more clutter, not just on Twitter, but throughout social media. So it's very important that you utilize the tools to not just get your message out or try to get your message out, but I really believe that the utility of social media today for business owners and social entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders is as a place for connection and a place to build fruitful relationships. I have got some relationships that I built totally on social media. And a lot of that are people who I do business with on a consistent basis. They're members of the media. And so social media as a business utility is very, very important. There are a lot of people who will want you to do a number of things for free that will give you quote unquote exposure, but you always have to check and see whether or not any opportunity that people give you that is going to take time away from your business, whether or not it is going to bring value to what you're trying to do. Local TV reporters, radio, digital reporters, print journalists, all now can be reached and contacted through social media. You can even pitch your stories that way. So I would encourage everyone to begin to follow and share stories, because you're really helping our local journalists when you share their stories. And don't be creepy, but it's really important to follow those people and share their stories and interact with them, because you can actually make pitches to folks these days through social media. So media's changing. I want to say that it's more important now than ever that we tell our stories, especially people of color, people coming from communities that have been underserved. And I was really encouraged today to see that the Dallas Morning News is starting a partnership with Texas Metro News and Cheryl Smith. That is something that I wanted to do a long time ago. And I just want to give a shout out to Mike and his team and everybody that makes that happen, because it's super important that we tell these stories and reach out to legacy media to do so, and any other media channel that we can.
Thank you so much, Sean. And with that, I think you built a perfect segue to Mike, who can tell us more about those partnerships and what the Dallas Morning News has going on during this COVID time.
Thank you, Prisma. Thanks for the shout out, Sean. I appreciate it. I also want to thank Alex for her perspective on what journalists are dealing with right now. I think she has a keen insight into the pressures on journalists and the work that they're doing. I want to tell you a little bit about where the Dallas Morning News is coming from and what our focus is, and frankly has been even before COVID and before George Floyd, in hopes that it will give you some insight into how to help us tell the stories you think are important. So my focus as editor, particularly in the last couple of years, now that we've built a strong digital organization, has been to reestablish ourselves in communities that we used to cover well, but for financial reasons haven't covered as well anymore, or to begin to cover communities that we frankly never covered as well as we should have. The partnership with Texas Metro News falls into the latter category, where again, before George Floyd, before 2020, we had a strong recognition at the Dallas Morning News that we did not represent the voices enough of marginalized minority communities in the Dallas area. So that's been a focus in both the way that we hire and the way that we assign stories. Now that we have seen the world change from a social justice point of view, now that we've seen tens of thousands of our neighbors take to the streets asking for, demanding simple recognition and humane treatment, that's become obviously a giant story in our country, and a huge obligation for us as a newspaper to cover that that conversation in a full-throated and fair way. So this simple search for inclusion in the community is probably the biggest story that I've covered in my 37-year career, tied with the other one that we're dealing with right now, which is a giant global pandemic that's affecting our community and sickening and killing our neighbors and friends. So it's an intense time to to do journalism, but I can tell you that we're extremely focused on those two issues right now. What is the health best for the health and welfare of the community from a simple physical health standpoint, but also what's best for the health and welfare of the community, and what stories need to be told from a social justice standpoint. Lastly, I'll say it's critically important to us that our coverage of those questions does not end when the protests subside. That what comes out of the protests, what conversations we have as a community as a result of the protests that have happened are a hugely important story to the Dallas Morning News. Who gets together and makes a new plan? Whose power is challenged and ceded to someone else? How do our elected officials take this responsibility to create a more just society? So those are the stories that we'll be covering closely.
Thank you so much, Mike. I know that we'll have plenty of questions for you addressing some of those topics you just mentioned. But first, I wanted to turn it over to Creighton Webb.
Thanks, Prisma, and I've enjoyed the comments that have been made so far. We've been spending a lot of time with our clients, helping them advise through these crisis situations. How do they respond? What do they say? When do they say it? And some of the reactions have gone very well, and some have gone very poorly. And by the same token, there's a number of brand managers with corporations, particularly those who are focused on corporate social responsibility, and in nonprofits that are trying to break through the clutter and tell their story amidst so much tumultuousness that's going on. I would say there have been, on the crisis side, two major observations. First, most brands, for-profit and not-for-profit, were not prepared. Not for COVID, and certainly not for the conversation on racial equity following the murder of George Floyd. Second, what is for many a natural instinct, no matter when or what the crisis, that has followed true in these situations as well. And that is the natural instinct for most organizations is to batten down the hatches, to not say or do anything. And so really, especially as it relates to COVID, that's a mistake and has been a mistake. We've been trying to encourage folks that when it comes to a crisis, particularly like COVID, you've got to communicate early and you've got to communicate often to all of your stakeholders, particularly your employees, if you're a nonprofit, your donors, all of your stakeholders. They need to hear from you. So many brands want to sacrifice the perfect for the good, right? They don't want to say anything until they have all the information, the I's dotted, the T's crossed. And the problem is that creates a lot of consternation within your organization, a lack of trust. People want to hear from leadership, even if the answer is, I don't know. So approaching things with authenticity and openness has been critical, particularly as it relates to COVID. As it relates to the follow up of after the murder of George Floyd, totally different situation. So many brands reacted very, very early with outrage and in many cases posturing on social media and just got lambasted. And there are some rules of the road to social media and whether you react and post in a crisis situation. Is it relevant to you and your brand? Are you going to set a precedent? Are you going to comment every time? Take a natural disaster or a shooting, for example. You post, our hearts and prayers go out to the victims of the shooting in Paris, France. But are you prepared for the next shooting to do the same thing? And so on and so on. And the same with natural disasters. But we saw a real shift in the conversation about 3 weeks after it broke nationally, this conversation on racial equity, and where it became very obvious that the brands that had been more conservative, more careful, and had not said anything about their position on racial equity, even in a very humble way, became noticeably absent from the conversation. So long story short, brands that are being successful right now or in breaking through are having to use all the mediums of communication. Social obviously is critical right now, but traditional media still has huge influence, particularly from a negative perspective. If you're a brand that's under duress and you have a negative news story, that can really impact you. By the same token, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, so I'll just kind of tease this, there are certain organizations that have a natural advantage right now in breaking through the clutter and in getting a reporter's attention. And I love Alex's comment about relationships and relationships with reporters and making friends when times are good. The question is the details. How do you do that? How do you actually build a relationship with a reporter, especially right now, knowing how terribly busy they are, how understaffed newsrooms are, and how many stories a day, particularly on the broadcast side, that reporters are having to generate on social, on the web, and on the air. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Creighton. I think, it's definitely a time where certain organizations might have an advantage and others maybe not so much, and in particular, some communities. And so with that, I think Diane Solis can give us a little bit more about the coverage she's doing, and in particular with certain communities that maybe wouldn't have that coverage, especially during this time. Diane, would you go ahead?
As I said from the top, I'm really interested in telling memorable stories in an increasingly complex world. And as the pandemic hit, more and more people were joining food lines, and I was stunned by that. And I wanted to write a story about who was in the line, but many people were doing that. They were going to food lines and interviewing people and talking about their tremendous needs. I went to a food line and was very impressed by a Catholic priest and his humility and the manner in which he approached people and gave them food. And it frankly seemed biblical to me watching him. And I got there because I have a long relationship with a nonprofit called Dallas Area Interfaith. And I knew they were going to do it. And I said that they were going to help organize this food line, and that Catholic Charities of Dallas would be there delivering the food as well. And I've written many stories with them in the past. And so I went there, and the story became a look at the pandemic and the tremendous needs through the eyes of this priest, who was a Mexican immigrant and had been poor, like so many of those people that he was serving. He was also a very colorful guy. He sings really well. I once went to one of his masses, and they were playing this rock music. I wasn't sure should I pray or should I dance? It was very, very different from my Catholic experience. And he paints religious pictures, and they hang in the church. He's really good. He's like Modigliani, he's that good. And so that was how I did that story. And it was kind of spontaneous, but I did have those long relationships with two big nonprofits, the biggest one being Catholic Charities of Dallas. They didn't really know that I was going to do this story. And frankly, I didn't know until I left and I was thinking about it. Another story that I recently did was a look at 75211. It's the zip code in Dallas County that has the largest number of COVID infections. It has one of the highest rates per capita as well. And I got tapped on the shoulder by my wonderful science writer colleague to see if I wanted to team up. And I'd already done a story on Latinos being on the front lines and therefore more susceptible to COVID. And this seemed like a natural piece to do next. And I went looking for families, and Facebook became my big friend, my big ally. It was long-time relationships that I had with people that enabled me to find families who were willing to talk, two families in particular, and a relationship that I had with an immigrant leader in Dallas who had just started a nonprofit called Somos Texas. And that is how that story came together. We also interviewed the Dallas County Commissioner about what was being done in this real hot spot of our county. And then I also had to move to this reckoning on injustice. And I knew that the anniversary was coming of what may be the most horrid case in the US of police brutality, and that is the killing of 12-year-old Santos Rodriguez in 1973. And I thought about taking two approaches, and one was the one that I finally chose, which was to talk to his mother about the reckoning and about all the deaths that have happened since Santos. And I did a series of very short interviews with her by phone. At one time I went to her house, and I put together a piece moving through what happened to her 47 years ago and how she views the reckoning now, and what the city of Dallas did and didn't do back then. And the next day, there was a memorial at the cemetery, and I just went just to pay my respects. The family asked if I was going to go, and I said, yeah, I'm going to go. And so I showed up, and there was this woman that showed up and right away, and she put blue flowers at the tombstone, and then the photographer and I said, who is that? And then we realized, oh, it is Chief Renee Hall. So it was an extraordinary experience. And she spoke to Santos Rodriguez's mother afterwards. It was really quite moving, and I got very close so that I could hear and videograph with my phone what she said. I think that people were very surprised by Chief Hall's gesture, and it came at a very critical time.
Thank you, Diane. I know that we want to hear a lot more about these stories that you've written and you've shared, and so many other platforms are sharing during this time. But I wanted to switch gears a little bit to just start by asking a few questions that are more on the technical side of things. And so, I know that throughout all of the comments that were mentioned just now, we keep hearing how individuals and organizations can really leverage the, social impact through, through social media or other means. So I want to just broadly turn it over to Sean and ask him, how can we, how can social impact organizations just leverage that media engagement to amplify their message? And I know that he started to talk about some of these social media tips and so maybe you can expand on that, and then we'll get into some other questions.
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at the media, especially legacy media, print, broadcast, radio, digital media, as your partner. And a partner in trying to get your message out. And I think, a lot of people and organizations just think about, why don't they tell my story? I have the best story. Why don't they tell my story? And Diane and her colleagues get a lot of great stories. And I have a lot of great clients, nonprofit clients that I work with, who have great stories. And so it's not from a lack of stories to tell. It becomes incumbent upon us, PR professionals like us, and for nonprofits and social entrepreneurs who may not want to or feel they can engage with a PR company, to partner with their media and their local media. And what that looks like is kind of what I got into a little bit earlier. It is following them on social media. It is developing a relationship on LinkedIn. And it is a partnership. And I think a lot of organizations look at this as one way, as they need to tell my story. And it has to be also helping to amplify the stories that the legacy media is telling too, because journalism is in crisis, and it has been for quite some time. And so we need to, besides subscribing to our local newspapers, and Mike, you don't have to worry about it, this one is for free, by subscribing to our local papers, but also helping to amplify the story so that when you need a story to be told or have a great story, it is not cold. They have an understanding of who you are, what you do, what your clients do, what your business is. And so I think if I could say anything, it would just be to switch that mindset shift from just trying to push stories to our local media partners to also trying to help them amplify other stories as well.
Yeah, and I think when we think about our nonprofits that are within our SVP portfolio, sometimes it is, maybe something where we could cultivate more of that relationship. And sometimes you're right, it could appear to be a one-way street. And so as we're moving into, some of these ways to engage the media, I think we want to clarify for our audience just some of the key differences on how to engage. I mean, I know here we're talking about media within traditional media, digital media, and I know that if you're a nonprofit, maybe have no communications budget and don't even maybe have a marketing person, it'd be good to identify some of those key differences on how to engage broadcast, print, social media. And so if Alex would share with us a little bit more about what those differences are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to understand what it is for each of these different channels and each of these different reporters and producers, what it is that they need in order to do their job and in order to tell their story. But more importantly, how are they getting that information in times of COVID-19? For example, broadcast is a really visual medium. So when you're pitching reporters or producers, what is that moment that you're giving to them? And are you going to be able to provide that visual? Are they sending crews out, or do you need to give them visuals? You need to give them B-roll. Some aren't sending crews out at all, and it really does vary by station. We did an event just 2 weeks ago where we learned that even if a station sends a crew out, they might not be doing on-camera interviews because of COVID-19 and social distancing protocols. They might just try to plug into your remarks so they can grab quotes from that. At that same event, though, we had a different station who wanted interviews with leadership, with consumers. They wanted behind-the-scenes tours so they could grab their own visuals and put together their own package. So it really does vary, and part of that is just that partnership that Sean talked about, and just understanding how we can be good resources. And then for print and online, a really huge part of what we're seeing is just understanding what our targets are writing about, what are they experts in, what are they interested in, and how is that changing on a day-to-day basis in light of what's happening around the country. Just to echo what Sean said about relationships earlier, we've seen a lot of success when we're following reporters on social media. And just anecdotally, in the past few months, I've become close with a reporter in Denver for a national network. But he's been posting a lot on his Instagram stories while he's reporting from the field and talking about the pieces that he's working on. So we'll chat about what he's seeing, what he's hearing on the ground, where he plans to take the narrative. And there have been a few times where I've seen him post something that might be relevant for our brands, and we've been able to source and secure interviews just through direct message. And then speaking of digital and social, in addition to following your typical outlets on their social platforms, Dallas Morning News has a really great social presence, for example. And with those, there are oftentimes different producers and editors who are curating that content. So you can also reach out to them in addition to the typical news desk that you might be pitching stories to. We've had a couple of successes reaching out to Good Morning America, for example, by reaching out to their digital producers in addition to some of their bookers. But in addition to those standard platforms, there's a lot of new and emerging channels as well, especially on social media. There's a lot of outlets and content producers who are really focused on sharing good news to try to break through the clutter of all the negativity that we're hearing.
Thank you, Alex. And I think that, leads us into a conversation about messages and how we can all share messages as individuals. And of course, the audience and people want to hear both sides, right? We want to hear, some of the things that are happening that are not so positive and uplifting, but of course, we want to hear those positive messages as well. And so I know that the questions are coming in, and we will have time, to address those. So please keep submitting them. But I did want to, during Creighton's, deep dive, he mentioned messaging and how nonprofits or other social impact organizations can really make their message unique and compelling. So maybe Creighton, if you can expand on that.
Well, I mentioned that there are some organizations that have a natural benefit right now, and if you're if you're a nonprofit development officer or fundraiser or executive director, CEO, it probably really doesn't feel like you got a lot of benefits right now. But from what's your story and the story you have to tell, I think there are some opportunities. First, generally speaking, the media, particularly as Alex said, with all the negativity right there, they love a hero story. And they also love a story about survival, something that's about being against all the odds, something that's a surprise. And nonprofits often have those kinds of real people stories because, you know, you can be a brand, a for-profit organization, and you call and you pitch a reporter. It's especially difficult to break through because, you know, reporters typically, I still think of myself to some degree as a journalist, we're kind of a cynical bunch. So you figure, well, you're calling me because you want something. And, you know, I'm just likely to send you down the hall to the sales department to buy some advertising, unless you can tell me a compelling story. As a nonprofit, you've got this advantage because I think reporters, generally speaking, realize that you have more selfless motives and that you're very impacted right now. Nonprofits also have numbers, and very relevant numbers. For example, I think on the call today, Virginia Hoke from Children's is here. Well, of course, Children's and the other hospitals have foundations, but they also have data that reporters want to get their hands on. And I think nonprofits also can have a relevant hook to the situation. Another one of our participants today is Jason Dyke, who founded Carson's Village, and they provide support to families who lose a loved one by surprise or in a surprise situation, whether it's suicide or COVID. And can you imagine right now their phone is ringing off the hook? Here's this small nonprofit organization that provides this service that's unique. And they're getting a lot of attention right now because that's a unique story that's very relevant. So we talked about building reporter relationships, but how do you do that? And I think that's where nonprofits also, or even this is why you see so many corporate social responsibility executives pitch stories about CSR and their relationships with nonprofits, because it seems less self-serving and more is helping to solve one of society's problems, particularly that is relevant right now to racial equity or to COVID. But in particular, when nonprofits are building relationships with reporters, it's very difficult in the middle of a crisis to call up a reporter and say, hey, you know, my name is Bob Jorgensen. We've never met before, but I wanted to introduce myself to you. That's hard, right? It's really hard to get their attention, which is why it's so important to make friends when times are good. Before you're in crisis, you're calling the reporter and you're introducing yourself and you're saying, this is what my organization does. This is the problem we're trying to fix. This is the data that I can provide for you on a regular basis. Keep my number, right? Keep a text if I could ever be a resource to you. I think finally, nonprofits typically provide good, compelling spokespeople. Not only real people who are being impacted, but also oftentimes the CEO of nonprofits are very good, passionate advocates that make themselves available to reporters to go on camera or to be interviewed under the deadlines that the reporters have. They've got colorful and interesting stories to tell. And that's not always the case with corporate types, as we know. We've all tried to media train our CEOs or those folks that we were going to put in front of a camera, and sometimes it works better than others. So making yourself a resource, an expert, a thought leader, and letting reporters know that you're there, that you exist, and that you've got some stories to tell that benefit them and not just you, that can really go a long way.
Thank you, Creighton. And I think that, you know, it's important to discuss maybe some of those differences, because I think some of our audience may want to learn more. And I think, you know, what better person to answer that question than Mike. Mike, you know, I know that, you know, there's maybe some confusion on like, well, what's the difference between a reporter, columnist, how do I submit an op-ed? Can you just address that before we move on?
Sure, I'll be glad to. And let me go back and say that I think all of my fellow panelists are really hitting the right note when they talk about relationships with journalists, understanding what reporters need, providing information. We understand that there may be a client that'll benefit from a story or whose message will get out, and that's okay. But we're always looking for that story that's going to be of compelling interest to the reader and importance to the community, regardless of the impact on the organization behind it. You asked about the difference between reporters and columnists, and it's a good question. So both are reporters. So a columnist is a reporter and a reporter is a reporter. However, a reporter is not a columnist. And what do I mean by that? So a reporter goes out and reports on the news and the context around the news and renders that in a way that's not meant to betray that person's personal view of the situation. A columnist is explicitly empowered to do the reporting on an issue, write about it, and then reach a conclusion about what he or she thinks. And you see this from Mitchell Schnurman in our business section, and I think Sharon Grigsby is a great example of a reporter columnist. She wrote the other day about the Plano Tomorrow plan. And when Charlie Scudder, who writes about our Collin County communities, when he writes about the Plano Tomorrow plan, he'll say, these are what the sides are saying, this is what the plan is, this is what the dispute is about, and that's it. When Sharon wrote about it, she said all that, she interviewed people, and she essentially said in the end, get your act together, Plano. You know, my view is you need to do X thing. And the difference in approach is it's good to know what columnists and reporters are focusing on and what they care about. You know, you only have to spend a few minutes listening to Diane Solis to hear the sort of social justice bent and the basically sort of humanity bent that she brings to what she does. In Sharon's case, she cares a lot about what happens in the city, but also in the suburbs. How is the community growing up? What are the gender and racial justice issues that she can touch on? So knowing what she's interested in and then going to a columnist and saying, hey, you know, you made the point the other day that X, well, I've got a really great idea for you that'll help you reinforce that point, or that you may want to look at it a different way, and it may open your eyes, but connect to what they're already doing if you can.
Thank you for that. I think, you know, when we heard from Diane, you know, we were hearing the stories that, you know, some of our organizations, social impact organizations want to hear, but it's also just displaying what people are experiencing during COVID. So it's, you know, with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I know Diane is fixing her microphone right now, but I'm going to just turn it back over to Sean. So maybe he can tell us a little bit more about the storytelling and narratives and why they're so important to motivate clients and volunteers, donors, and all of these audiences.
Yes, I think, you know, storytelling is so important regardless of kind of what field you're in. And as Creighton has alluded to, you know, if people are in the media and they go into different, to work for nonprofits and communications or on the PR side, it still becomes a storytelling that they take with them. And it's something that it needs to be a real focus. And in order to tell that story, it's really important for nonprofits to really have a good idea of who they are. And it's also important for them to take the time to write down what those messages are that they want people to know. And that's why it is, you know, it helps if they can engage people, reach out to folks like myself, like Alexandra, like Creighton, who can at least kind of give them some understanding or some guidance. And I think once you have that story written, once you have that narrative in a form where you would like to present it, I just really think it's so important to think about all of the different platforms. And we say it, and I just feel like it's so important to keep underscoring, because I believe in the digital world, we can get focused on one outlet, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, video, and still forget that there are others. And so for me, it's always been, in order to get those narratives out, try to do a multi-platform approach, try to do webinars like SVP is doing. We had an opportunity to do a webinar for the Bridge. I see Dr. David Woody is part of our attendees and participants today. And it is just, like never before, organizations, smaller organizations can communicate with donors directly and in a much more direct way. And I think there is a perception that it's only if you have the high dollars, if it's only if you have the right connections that you're able to connect with donors. in that way. And I'm just saying, once you have a story to tell, whether it be in an elevator pitch form, which is in a 15 to 30 second, if you get to bump into Mike at a game somewhere, if you find yourself on a call with him, if you have your story narrowed down in a way that you can quickly communicate what it is, what your vision is, and share it in different ways. And again, I think because we are looking at these new ways of communications, we forget about print journalism and we forget about email. And I have to tell you, there are a lot of people who are donors, for those of you who are nonprofits, who are doing fundraising, who the person that you need to see your project and hear your story might get it through a print newspaper or through an email. So I want to encourage everyone, once you have those narratives crafted, to make sure to share it in as many forms as you can, because donors are multi-platform, multi-generational. And so don't ever lose sight of that.
Thank you, Sean. I think something that we hear about is social justice. And I believe I read about your group and how they integrated social justice into what you're doing at Allen Media. And maybe that was only a couple of years ago. And so I wondered how, and I also want Mike to chime in on this for the Dallas Morning News. I wondered how social media, or social justice can be amplified, through these different channels. And I know that, it's unique that an agency like yours would add that to the offerings.
Well, I'll just start and I'll definitely turn it over, but I think we're very fortunate, and I want to give a lot of gratitude to our owners, Mary Woodleaf and Jennifer Pascal, because when I approached them last year about starting a social justice practice within our firm, they saw, number one, not just the value of the types of clients that we could serve and the types of messages that we could help amplify, but there was already a lot of the work that was going on in the firm, so it was being a lot more intentional about it. And so for us to have a social justice practice after the killing of George Floyd, it allowed us to already have a way to begin to amplify, not only for our clients who wanted to release statements and be able to advise them and let them know that we had already been doing this work and talking to them about being authentic in their voices and being direct and having something to say, but also to continue to follow up with it, because social justice isn't something that we should be trying to put on a bumper sticker. It isn't something that we should be trying to have some sort of quick and hip phrases around. It is a movement that is lasting. So for us, it's something that we've been doing and plan to continue to do. And we do it because it's the right thing to do, not because it's fashionable or because now it's the popular thing. We believe that a fair, just, and equitable society and moving towards that is something that we want to do. We don't always get it right, and that's part of it. We're all should be trying to move into a better place every day, and that's what we're doing, and that's what our social justice practice is founded on.
Wow, thank you so much for that response. And I read about that being added to the firm, and I thought, well, that's a big decision for some people, and I'm glad that the firm is moving in that direction. And Mike, what about the Dallas Morning News? I know we see a lot of it now, but it's been some time since we've definitely been hearing these messages, and sometimes we don't always get a positive response. So if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Well, sure. First, I want to join Sean in the "We Don't Always Get It Right" club. That's an absolute fact. You were asking about how media can amplify social justice questions and stories, and I think as I thought about that, one of the best examples that comes to mind in our recent experience is the work that our editorial board has done on the issue of human trafficking. So first of all, I've been looking at the guest list and I have many friends on this list, and I know it's a sophisticated audience, but just to be clear, the editorial and news departments operate separately and have no influence on each other. And so the editorial is the opinion part of the paper that gives our institutional view. Well, Brendan Miniter, who's the editor of editorials, made it an area of emphasis, a declared sort of focus to write about the impact of human trafficking on people in North Texas. And it's a kind of issue that's in the shadows a little bit, but the fact is that many, many people, especially women, are trafficked in the sex trade and have to endure and survive this experience. And Brendan has done a series of editorials with a lot of help from social impact organizations to illuminate this problem and to show solutions to it and to highlight stories of people who have survived trafficking and moved on in their lives. So, you know, a lot of what we do, I like to think, illuminates social justice issues, but that's a very clear example of Brendan working closely with North Texas organizations and doing his own independent reporting and his staff doing that to highlight an issue from an opinion perspective that we think the public needs to know about.
Thanks, Mike. And you know, that resonates definitely with me, and I know that with other organizations. I know one of the organizations that we support is Interrupt, and they deal with teen pregnancy, and they mentioned to me, like, you know, it's not a issue that people want to talk about, right? It's tough, and I think, you know, some of these conversations aren't going to be easy. Sometimes it's creating those relationships with the community, being allies to these organizations, these causes. So if Diane is okay with her mic now, I would like her to just respond a little bit to that, because I know she mentioned a Catholic priest she was talking to. She is out there in the community and also influencing the way that organizations are approaching some of these issues.
And so you want me to address how I approach issues?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, how you approach the community, and how do you build that relationship with the community as you're writing?
Okay, well, obviously there's always a first approach, and I've been at this a while, and so I may call on some complex policy issue and wanting to know how it's affecting real people, a nonprofit's clients. Sometimes I just call people up and I chat. I'm doing that a lot now, or I'm emailing with people. There's a nonprofit in Vickery Meadow that reached out to me right away. They were very fearful that COVID would spread in the Vickery Meadow area because it's so densely packed with families and apartments. And that led me to a story on a pharmacy that is a free pharmacy. They give meds away for those that are qualified. And I found that extraordinary. And I did a piece on that, looking at the doubling in the flow of people coming for help. And I established that relationship probably during the Ebola crisis, which has been six years ago. I stopped myself because I called it a crisis. We've had so many more deaths in this pandemic compared to what happened then. And there is a time of the year where a lot of people take vacations, and we at the Dallas Morning News look for features from reporters. And that's a great opportunity for me to start establishing relationships and bolstering relationships with corporations or nonprofits looking for maybe lighter stories. And I do that every Thanksgiving, every Christmas. And then something like this happens, this pandemic or this reckoning on injustice, and I tap into those relationships again, where people are letting me know what they're doing. They're texting me, they're sending me emails, contacting me on Facebook Messenger, and even on Instagram.
Wow. So, you know, I think we hear that, you know, we see that two-way where, you know, we can reach out to you. And I wanted to mention that, you know, at SVP, we're working with nonprofits and for-profit organizations within social impact. And we also have a social innovation conference, you know, and that's the kind of stuff where, you know, we want to promote it across different channels. And, you know, I think we need to go out and reach out to people like Diane and others that are writing stories about the work that's being done here in Dallas. You know, in terms of, we know that it's a pandemic, we hear what's on the other side, and it's almost like we're going through this, right? And so I think, you know, in terms of evaluation and how effective our strategies are, I think that's, I mean, something we still need to analyze and look for, right? So I think maybe Creighton, if you could talk a little bit more about how you can, you know, measure that. How do we measure success when we're a nonprofit or a social enterprise that we're trying to get a message across, and we know that even not sending a message is sending a message, right? So how do we measure effectiveness?
Sure. Honestly, from I think the chair of a nonprofit CEO, you know, it's money. It's are you fundraising? Are your storytelling efforts compelling donors to assist you, invest in you, and thereby you and your organization are able to help more people? I mean, that's the ultimate metric. Now, as a storyteller and as an agency owner, that always scares me, and I say that frequently because that's a pretty big delta to say, well, whether you're on Good Morning America or Good Morning Texas, you know, how you were able to translate that and connect the dots. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes people will say, hey, I wrote a check because I saw the story, but more often than not, it doesn't. So that leads to a bigger metric, which we haven't talked about today, and that's reputation. You know, despite everything I said earlier about the natural advantages that nonprofits have in storytelling, the obvious disadvantage is that there are so many of them, there are so many important causes, and so many social issues that are plaguing our community, our state, and our country, right? There is a lot of noise. So how do you stand out? And I think the organizations, the nonprofits in particular, and to some degree, the for-profits that have corporate social responsibility initiatives are developing thought leadership portfolios. And so, you know, it's not a foregone conclusion that if you're the executive director of a for-profit 501c3 or you're the CEO of a nonprofit organization, that you are considered by the media to be the expert, the source, the go-to organization or person. And so you really have to develop that profile, and really you have to develop it through all the different venues that we've been talking about. Some folks like to do podcasting, some are writing blogs, but most CEOs are pushing back and saying, I don't have time to do that. How do I get all that done? But in some way, shape, or form, even if you don't necessarily at the beginning have a lot of listeners or a lot of viewers, from a search engine optimization perspective, if your organization or its leader is putting out content, establishing yourself as an expert in a certain public policy arena or issue, and making yourself available to reporters and those who are interested and donors when the time is right. Again, even from a search engine optimization perspective, that content ends up making a difference. So I had one client recently who really pushed back. They said, you know, we don't want to do a podcast. We don't want to do a video podcast because our CEO doesn't have a lot of followers right now. And we're like, no, wait a minute. This isn't, if you have to build the content first in order to get the followers, and understand then it's still a long game. I just want to tease one thing. I'll pass it off because I don't want to take the time right now. But one of the things we haven't talked about right now is how do you afford outside support and help? And if you want to engage an agency or you want to engage a freelancer, how do you do that on a nonprofit budget and really be meaningful? I have been in many boardrooms as a volunteer, and I have said time and time and time again, you get what you pay for. And present company excluded, I think the other agencies here, including SunWest, we all make significant investments of time as well as money in working with the nonprofit organizations that we work with. But at some point, you're ready to make an investment in storytelling. And I think it might be worth at some point talking about how do you do that with a tight budget.
Thank you, Creighton. And we'll try to jump to that, but, you know, and maybe that's one of the challenges, right? So I know that our time is ticking, and please keep submitting those questions. The Q&A is open for the audience, and we will shift to those questions in a couple minutes. But in terms of opportunities and challenges, the pandemic has changed our lives, right? And so what does that mean? What does that mean at the Dallas Morning News? You know, what does that mean in our communities? And so Mike and Diane, maybe you can chime in as to like what kinds of opportunities and challenges you're seeing just because of COVID.
So let me say from an institutional point of view, one of the opportunities that we've seen is the opportunity to serve the community in crisis. So we've made stories that are directly related to people's health and welfare available for free digitally. So if there's a new ruling from the county or the state about restaurant capacity or mask wearing or so forth, then those stories are always free to any reader who comes to dallasnews.com. That's just part of fulfilling the community service function. But we've also taken the opportunity, I think, to demonstrate our value to the community. So when it comes to many of the stories of the social justice movement and many of the science and other stories surrounding COVID, that we've been able to provide, or we hopefully have been able to provide, information that people value and are willing to become subscribers to get to. I can tell you from a business perspective that by providing the coverage people care about the most, we've seen a significant uptick in digital subscribers, which after all, that's what we're building our business future on, is the idea that we'll have a strong digital audience for the next 135 years, going back to the 135 years we've already been doing this. And then the challenges, of course, are all, they're all logistical. We all live in this community as you do. And we all struggle with the same concerns about family, loved ones that anyone does. We've had members of our reporting staff who've become ill, unfortunately have recovered, but it's something that we're constantly having to struggle with. So the challenges have to do with the logistics of doing this work from remote locations, and frankly, as journalists, the ability to, or the inability to connect as closely with sources and stories as we typically have done. We still go out on stories, but we just do it, carefully and advisedly and using the right precautions.
Thank you. Diane, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, we've lost the intimacy of the interview, the in-person interview, and that's had quite an impact. I'm very careful about what stories I go out on in person, thinking through and planning what I might get from that interview that I would not get by doing a Zoom call or by picking up the phone. And we depend a lot on our fabulous photography staff. And during this pandemic, I've seen the depth of their character. It's been very moving, professionally and personally, to see that they care so much, and they know that for some assignments, many assignments, they're the eyes and ears for the writer. And that's the biggest challenge right now from my side as we go forward in a pandemic that is stretching into the 6th month now.
Yeah, definitely. And so with that, stretching into the 6 months, and we're unsure of so many things, I'd like to turn it over to Alex and just hear, we know that the consumers are using different platforms, other platforms are maybe evolving. So I wanted to just see what one information or what kind of training, or, not, as Creighton mentioned, one has the dollars, right, to go out and find someone that could help with this. So what kinds of things are out there, in particular for the nonprofits?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of organizations who are working to make learnings available as quickly as possible and as much as things are evolving so rapidly. Of course, I have to give a shout out to Social Venture Partners because they're a great example of an organization that's been working furiously to bring together thought leaders from different industries who can provide unique perspectives on what's happening in our community. At a national level, organizations like Engage for Good are also sharing case studies and lessons from around the country as it relates to both COVID and as it relates to the conversations around racial equity. And like Creighton mentioned, there are agencies and freelancers who can provide insights into what they're hearing. There's a lot of research happening across the industry right now about how consumers are feeling, what their perceptions are of different brands and how their consumption behaviors are changing. And there's a lot of sharing that's going around right now across vendors and across partners. But I think some of the most real-time information that you're going to get is going to come from the media itself, because that's how you'll see how they're pivoting and evolving their processes in real time. And that's why it's so important to understand who your primary audiences are and what information they're consuming, not just from a traditional standpoint, but the other ways that they're getting information. There's been a little bit of chatter in the Q&A about how people have grown skeptical of the media, and that's true. And over the past couple of years and months even, there's been a dramatic shift in how and who people trust as influential sources of information, whether that's traditional media or celebrities or social influencers or even our friends and family.
Thank you so much, Alex. And we will get to those questions in a couple minutes. So please keep submitting your questions in the chat box. And, you know, Sean, I didn't know if you had anything to add to that, to what Alex just mentioned to us about different resources available, you know, from your agency or your perspective.
You know, from my perspective, and I'm sure that you all have shared these things before, but I want to just reiterate for a lot of small nonprofits right now, what I've seen are people who have been doing tireless work, who have just really been so focused on serving their clients. And I think more than ever before, self-care is so important for our clients, and we are trying to talk to them about that. We have a partner organization at Alameda called Mastermind, where we do mindfulness and meditation and things like that. They're available not only to big corporations, but also to small nonprofits. I think that's important. And I think more than ever, for those of us who maybe the first month or so, as we've heard, now that we're stretching into month 6, we're kind of figuring out how we're going to work. Many of us have found that we have more work than we can shake a stick at. And I think organization tools for nonprofits are more important than they've ever been. And so if it's calendar tools, for me, I've had to go back to the old school paper planner and do the full focus planner. And there is also a partner podcast called Lead to Win that accompanies that, as well as a new book called The Vision Driven Leader by Michael Hyatt. I think that it is so important that nonprofits just take that time to maintain their organization and stay organized, because during this time, I've seen some smaller organizations missed opportunities through missed meetings, through missed calls, missed appointments. And we can have the right messaging, we can have the right communication strategy, we can set up a great meeting for our clients. But if they're not there, if they don't show up, if they don't show up with all the tools that they need, it's going to be important for them to get the results that they need. And so I would just really encourage our viewers today to focus on the organization.
Thanks, Sean. With that, I'm going to switch it over to some of the questions asked by our audience. And, you know, I think I'll ask this question for Creighton, because I know that he started to, you know, really push on the brand and how that's important. So Creighton, we have a question here from the audience that says, you know, how do you balance your statement as a brand with employee morale, right? Employees either will get encouraged or maybe discouraged by some of the messages. And sometimes that could be, you know, appear to be political, and you know, there will be a lot of differences. And so how does one do that? How do you balance your statement and your brand, but then also be authentic?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for giving me a chance to respond. You know, the greatest example of this that we've seen, and my colleague Melissa Cameron is on the call today, and she's seen this firsthand as well, and had several comments about it. It's really with for-profit organizations, corporations who on one hand want to make an investment in corporate social responsibility, whether it was COVID for organizations that were on the front line or in racial equity. And they were ready to make an announcement to their employees, but they didn't think about timing because it was at the same time that they were having to announce layoffs or that they were cutting bonuses or cutbacks. And really talk about cutting morale off at the knees. You know, if it's one thing, if it's a nonprofit organization as a good corporate citizen you've had a long-standing relationship with, it's part of your key cause programs, and your employees have heard about it before. But I think it's a natural inclination for employees to feel a little disenfranchised. If it happens all in that time. So I think it's really important to think about the timing and the exact message, and you know, why are you announcing publicly this major corporate social responsibility gift? Of course, if you're not making any money as a for-profit, you can't give any money away, as my old boss used to say at Mary Kay. But you want to announce it at some point, but you've got to consider, to your point, the employee audience as well. As it relates to more political matters, I think the murder of George Floyd was a great example where it's audience that really determines whether and how you weigh in and whether you decide to make it political or not. I think the many nonprofit organizations like to play it safe. I'm on the board for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Domestic violence impacts 1 in 3 women, and they're both Republicans and Democrats. Doesn't matter what your socioeconomic impact is. So many organizations want to keep it safe that people from all ilks, backgrounds, ethnicities, as well as political backgrounds can feel like they can weigh in. By the same token, I think as it related to Black Lives Matter and racial equity, while the normal rule of thumb is you only weigh in a tragedy on social media if it's a fit for your mission. You only weigh in if you're going to be noticeably absent from the conversation if you don't. You only weigh in if the juice is worth the squeeze, right? And you're got thick-skinned enough to take the blowback. And you only weigh in if you're prepared to set a precedent and going to comment here on out. I think we saw a real shift following the murder of George Floyd, where nonprofits felt compelled that they would have been noticeably absent if they did not make a public comment about social justice. The litmus test for whether they should or should not comment is really their audience. Do their employees expect it? Do their donors expect it? Does their board expect it? Do the stakeholders expect it? And you've got to be real careful to make sure you're not too early and that it looks like your comments are posturing and that you're only just expressing outrage. And instead are replacing that with actual action and authenticity. But you also want to make sure that you're not too late. So in this instance, you really got to thread the needle and you really have to know your individual audience.
Thank you so much, Creighton. You know, as we're thinking that, I mean, we've had several questions from the audience about being gracious to the situation and how do we make sure that we're, you know, carrying out those messages in the right approach and the right voice. I don't know if any of our panelists want to add to Creighton's comments, or we can move on to the next question from the audience.
Let me just say one thing, and that is for organizations, and we did a webinar, 5 things to consider when releasing statements on racism. And one thing that's so important is to get a diverse perspective on what statement you're trying to release or what you're trying to say, because there are certain words, there are certain phrases that you can have the best intentions of, and once you release that information, it could be received very poorly. That doesn't mean to go to the one African-American person in the firm and just bombard them with everything that you have a question about. But it is very important to have other eyes to look at those statements and how you respond, because I've seen from some of our clients that there's a person who they had at a lower position in their firm who was a person of color who they had to elevate in order to help lead them through this time. And that helped them see the value of having that person and seeing them more than just whatever position that they had them in. And I think that that's what diversity brings to organizations, and that's how it can help them through some of what Creighton's describing.
Thanks, Sean. And I know that we have a question from an audience member. And he mentions that maybe in some cases, you know, his opinion is that maybe these stories might increase vulnerability and in certain populations. And, you know, but the question is, what suggestions can be offered and, you know, for pushing back maybe on the inability to, of some to listen and to accept how systems hurt the vulnerable. Sean, you know, I'm going to pass it back to you, and then maybe we can hear from Mike about this. You know, if, you know, how can we, how can media or how can we push back on some of the messages being shared?
I saw that question come in from Dr. Woody. So glad that he's on and for the work that he does at the Bridge. You know, I think that for me, as we have been encouraging our clients to be fully open and transparent through this, it's so important to have truthful and factual responses, because this is an education for a lot of people during this time. Since the death of George Floyd, there are people who have seen things and heard things that they've never heard. You know, again, to reference John Lewis, I was listening to the radio to someone who had no clue of the contribution that John Lewis had made throughout the history of the United States and his work in civil rights. And so for a lot of people, it truly is an education. And there are some folks who, regardless of how many times you try to educate them or give them new information, that it will not change their opinions or views. But it does not mean that we stop, and it does not mean that we hide away from the truth. And so I think that's what this movement has become and what it is about. You know, if I think about Santos Rodriguez, you know, I'm still learning things. I learned some things when I went out to the memorial where Diane was on last Saturday that I didn't know. And so as we are pushing back has a lot to do with giving information. And for sometimes it becomes frustrating because you feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again. And for me, there are things that I'm sharing that I did shared on my blog all the way back in 2006. But I think that's the pushback, Dr. Woody, that and to those who are on, that it has to be a long process, and it's not going to happen overnight. And we're going to continue to get people who aren't going to want to listen to the message, but we have to just continue on.
Thank you, Sean. Mike, did you want to chime in on that conversation?
Yeah, you know, from a news perspective, it's just an obligation that we have to tell the true stories of how different populations are affected by social injustice, by COVID, or by whatever. But I really sympathize with Dr. Woody with this question of how do you address people who are pushing back against that or don't want to hear the message, because it's something that as a newspaper editor I deal with every day. There's you know, many people are not comfortable confronting the reality that some of their neighbors live with. And from us, since I am not in the public relations business, I'm in the news business, then information is a little bit more of a hammer for me. I just keep giving it to people because I feel that my job is to inform them, and what they do with that information is up to them. But through both news stories and editorials, we want to keep shining light on the realities in our community, and as we say in the journalism business, helping to comfort the afflicted. So it's just that persistence that we bring to it. My much more deft and graceful communications colleagues can probably speak better to how to persuade unwilling audiences to hear this.
Thank you, Mike. And I know we're getting close to our time, but I did want to mention, you know, trust and the shift in so much noise is one of the big concerns, right? Losing trust in our media and not being sure what to trust, right? You know, as much as we want to share those messages on social media, right? I can go out and post something and maybe I don't have all the facts. So, you know, this question is for Mike, and I also want Diane to chime in on this. You know, there's a lot of misinformation by omission, or maybe stories that don't capture all of the parts, right? And so how does the Dallas Morning News make sure that you're properly documenting, verifying the information, the sources, and presenting it and you know, to the audience, to our public?
Well, so this question of trust is an incredibly important one, and not just from my perspective as a media person, but just my perspective as an American citizen who loves this experiment that we've had going here for almost 250 years. It's the lack of trust in institutions generally that is such a threat to the union. It's lack of trust in institutions like universities, scientific institutions and findings, information providers like the Dallas Morning News. What unites us is, and if we can unite around a certain set of facts and a certain set of ideas, and we can solve them together. But if we decide that there's no truth and there's no simple reality that we have to deal with, then there's no way for us to deal with it together. So the way that, and I'll tell you, this is a battle for us in the media, and I'm not sure that we are winning it. We've continued to rely on our traditional tools of fact-checking, providing information, correcting errors, which is an enormous builder in trust. If you're dealing with a news source or a information source that doesn't correct errors or acknowledge errors, then you should be very suspicious of that news source. So we're trying to do all that, but the forces arrayed against the idea that there is any truth are immense and powerful, and it's a very difficult fight for a regional newspaper to be in.
Yeah, and in terms of Diane, I know that you're out there doing the work, boots on the ground, right? And so tell us a little bit more about that. Trust.
Sure.
How do these community members trust you to tell their story? And I know you work with a vulnerable population.
I do. I don't know that I can match Mike's eloquence. Thank you. That was really wonderful view on trust in institutions in general. What I try and do at a practical level is use video, use tweets of the video, use hyperlinks in my story so that people can go back and check the underlying document where the information comes from. And I love audio. I don't use it that much, but we just did a huge piece out of Texas Presby Hospital on what happened when one of their own doctors early on got COVID, and there's this huge group photo of the staff, maybe 30 people, and there's audio clips with each person, so you get the intimacy that comes with a theater of sound, and you hear people saying that, so you can judge authenticity and sincerity in that way.
Thank you, Diane. I know we're getting close to our time, so I just want to, thank all of you panelists, and just as a closing question, what has been the biggest change in your opinion, or maybe the lesson learned during this COVID pandemic? And if we could just quickly go around, maybe kick it off with Creighton.
Well, there have been so many. I mean, I think the uniqueness of this is that we're still in the middle of it. So, I was on a call this morning with the Dallas Citizens Council and the Dallas Regional Chamber, where Rob Kaplan, the president of the Dallas Fed, was on. And, to listen to the economic predictions are pretty bleak. I guess brass tacks, when it comes to storytelling and nonprofits, I think we're having to be creative. I think we're having to think outside the box, and I think we're having to prepare for a new normal. Now, granted, the things that we were worried about 4 months ago, frankly, now almost seem routine. But Kaplan's point this morning was, if we don't do what we need to do now, wear a mask, social distance, stay home maybe, or just wash your hands, the economic consequences, if this virus continues and the numbers continue to be so much worse, are going to be terrible. Six months from now, a year from now, lingering economic consequences. So, long story short, for nonprofits who are serving those who are most greatly impacted, and the numbers show it, people of color have been more greatly impacted by the economy and have been more greatly impacted by COVID. So there's a lot of work to do. And for those of us who are storytellers, and both on the news side or the agency side, I think we have to remember that not only are we in business, but we have an obligation and a duty to give back, to be part of the solution, and to continue to keep this top of mind But I would say lastly, that there has to be some hopefulness as well, some optimism. And we cannot forget that we're a special country. We're a special place. Dallas is a special city. We've been through difficult times before, but we're all going to have to be creative, vigilant, have a lot of grit. But I'm hopeful that we'll get through this.
Thank you, Creighton. Would you like to add a couple of words?
Just a couple of words, besides thank you to you and SVP for this opportunity. I take this opportunity to build new relationships. You know, we have in our firm, and I have personally gained new clients through this who I have not had the opportunity to meet in person, and some because we pretty much did everything over phone call, haven't even seen. And so we've even transitioned to doing more and myself, more virtual coffees, more virtual lunches, more virtual happy hours, and trying to find out how to as we heard earlier, as Diane was saying with in-person interviews, you know, I love in-person meetings to get to sit across from someone. And I kind of purposely did not do much working from home, but now that I am, I'm trying to figure out how can I bring all that was good in the past way that we did business and do it in a new way. And so I would encourage all of our nonprofits to use these tools to build relationships, because it can be done and we'll be better for it once we're done.
Thank you, Sean. Alex, Mike, Diane, any final words?
Yeah, we've talked a lot in the past hour and a half about the scrutiny that media and nonprofits alike are facing right now to be accountable and transparent to their stakeholders, to their audiences. And so to echo Creighton, continue to be creative, continue to find ways to evolve, but also really continue to be authentic to your mission and be authentic to who you're serving, whether that's from the perspective of providing information or whether that's from the perspective of providing social services. There's still a lot of work to be done, but there are a lot of really great stories to be told as well.
Thank you, Alex. Diane, Mike, any final closing words from you?
So for me, you asked about what have we learned? What are the lessons of this time? The questions that are out there for me are, can we still come together as a people in service of the common good and defeat something like COVID? Or can we be united enough to do that? And can we be united enough to overcome the historical wrongs that we've done as a country to achieve to actually realize the greatness that I know that we all know sort of resides in this country? Can we confront and deal with the historical racism and injustice that's existed in America? That's the story that I think we're covering. I don't know the answers to those things, but that's my job, is to tell that story.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
And just to add to that, I turned to Brian Stevenson, the fabulous social justice activist and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. And what he says is that in the social justice fight, the biggest enemy is hopelessness. So I'm hoping that people keep having hope.
Thank you, Diane. And you know, we've reached the end of our conversation today, but I wanted to thank all of you panelists for engaging in this conversation. I know there are many questions left, and we don't have all the answers, but I know that we can work together to amplify our messages and help our social impact organizations. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and also thank you so much to our sponsors, Something Good Consulting Group and Bright Knatzer Law, for their support in this time for this workshop today. If you've been following us on social media and have your own posts, you can use the hashtag SVPD Workshop. You know, and we're here to increase the capacity of social impact organizations within North Texas. If you'd like to join as a sponsor or a partner, please visit us at www.svpdallas.org. And also we have another webinar next week, Housing Response, where we will talk more about the housing crisis. You can log in, visit our website, and also register for that. And of course, the Big Bang Conference, as I mentioned earlier, will be coming up in October. And so please sign up. Tickets are on sale now for Big Bang, Equity in Action. The next 100 years is the theme. And wanted to acknowledge, and I know, Sean, you acknowledge the funeral of John Lewis, and, a civil rights leader and icon in our world. And, if you look today at the New York Times, you'll see that there is, an essay that he has written, "Together You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation." And so please check that out. He mentions, "Though I am gone, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe." Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you again at the next SVPD workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.